This is the Beyond Belief Sobriety podcast, where we examine topics of interest to people who seek a secular path to recovery from addictions of all kinds. Well, today I have a guest who has written an amazing book. Her name is Beth Aich, and her book is titled We're Not All Egomaniacs, Adapting the 12 Steps for Alcoholics with Low Self-Esteem. And it's an incredible book. She starts by relating her own personal story growing up and how her experience as a child impacted her self-esteem, and then what she discovered about Alcoholics Anonymous and the approach that the founders took with recovery, not really fitting with a person who's dealing with self-esteem issues. So anyway, it's a very incredible book that you put together here. What I'm really amazed at, Beth, is how long did it take you to do this? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here.
Well, 35 years of sobriety and about a year of writing.
Okay.
It was all been forming in my head over a long time.
Yeah. And I know that you gave a talk on this topic about, was it in 2018?
In Toronto.
In Toronto.
Yeah.
And this really goes into a lot more detail than that. And that was a very popular talk. A lot of people could relate to it. And I think, honestly, that was the first time, to be honest with you, that I ever really thought in terms that, that I was forcing myself into some sort of a role that it didn't really fit for me. And it was really, a different way of looking at things for me at that time. So I don't know. Why don't we just get right into this book? You start by describing your own personal story growing up and how your relationship with your parents and your family impacted your self-esteem. And I wonder if we could start with that.
Yeah. I thought my family was completely normal. I had no idea that there was abuse or neglect going on. But I always felt bad. By the age of 5, I knew there was something horribly wrong with me. And I attribute it, we're all born precious, right? Nobody looks at a newborn baby and says, well, you deserve to have bad things happen to you. But somewhere along the line, we lose that feeling. And a lot of our formation of our, who we are happens by the way that we're treated by our caregivers and what they reflect back to us to show us who we are. And my mom just always looked annoyed or contempt, looked on me with contempt. And I don't know why. I think she didn't want to be a mother. but she went on to have 4 more kids after me, and I was the second one. So I didn't know what to make of that, but and she also made everyone fit her reality. Like when you would ask for something, if she didn't want to do it right now, because she was always reading, and it wouldn't be like, I'll help you out in 5 minutes. I want to finish this chapter first. It would be like, you're lazy, selfish, and you're responsible. Why don't you get it yourself? And it was always not just this specific behavior that you're in trouble for. It was, you're contemptible and disgusting, and the whole person, rejection of the whole person.
Yep. I could really relate to that. I grew up in a similar environment. My mother was mentally ill, so a lot of the cues I got from her verbally and non-verbally were really similar. And also from my father, who was dealing with the stress of having somebody mentally ill in the household. And not really understanding, growing up that I was, that wasn't normal, But what I find interesting, Beth, is later in the book, and I don't want to jump ahead too far, but this is the part that really touched me, is when you're dealing with this stuff later on in your recovery, you have a way of addressing it. I mean, you're not judging your mother. You understand that she came with her own trauma, but you have a way of standing up to her finally and addressing the behaviors and the actions. I find myself too often excusing what my parents had done and not really addressing the harm. You know, does that make sense? It seems like you had a healthy way of addressing the harm that I never really thought of or incorporated.
It took a while. I mean, everybody kind of has their parents on a pedestal and is willing to excuse their behavior. But, having become a parent myself, did that mean all my behavior should get a pass because I'm a parent now? I certainly never gave that option to myself, right? In fact, when you become a parent, you really realize how much you don't know, rather than, deserving to be on some sort of pedestal. And I just needed to make the distinction that when you looked down on me all the time, that wasn't because I'm contemptible and unlovable. That was because you didn't have the capacity to love your children. And because I need that separation. And actually, once I've done that, then my relationship with my mother can get better. But I also learned not to go to her for the things you would expect a mother to have to offer, because she doesn't.
She didn't have it within her. Yeah. I guess that I was somehow conditioned to so much so, and you talk about this too in the book. The conditioning that I got from my experience in AA was to focus on me so much and just forgive the other person, And I understand there's power in forgiveness and everything, but it was almost like letting that off the hook and going ahead and accepting the responsibility for what they did when I was just a child,
Right. Yeah.
And
what was your part in it?
Exactly. What is your part in it? And that is just drilled into us in traditional AA, the way that the steps are worded. What is our part?
That's not how you deal with trauma.
No.
That is not how you handle trauma.
It's not. So why don't we go back a little bit and talk about why that is? You wrote about the history behind AA a little bit and why the steps are written in such a way. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah. Well, this is just my opinion, but, based on having read a lot of about early AA, and the earliest members of AA all seem to have this similar personality type of being the egomaniac, being grandiose, being very self-centered, putting their needs ahead of others all the time, and it's narcissistic behavior. I mean, I've kind of started using the word egomaniac and narcissist interchangeably, but it got sort of conflated with, so this is the alcoholic personality type. And I imagine that the first AAs were all like that because they were the lowest bottoms, because they were the ones who could not admit defeat, who could not admit to being, I'm not all powerful, I'm not omnipotent, because any admission of that is too harmful to their psyche. Now these people had trauma too, but they developed a different strategy.
Exactly.
There are nowadays, they say there's 4 types of response to trauma, and a healthy person, can use all 4 at different times. And but some of us just develop like a survival strategy, and Bill's was to dominate.
I found that interesting.
Yeah, but mine wasn't. Mine was to be codependent and appeasing and avoid conflict and always put others' needs ahead of my own.
Right. That's interesting. I wonder if you might think, looking at Bill and knowing his history, how how he grew up, and he was pretty much abandoned by his parents and had a lot of trauma growing up. Um, he may have had low self esteem, but he compensated for it or coped with it by insisting that he be the best at everything, that he be, that he not ever be second place. He'd be the top. I think he said
Yeah,
in his biography, the top man.
yeah, that's narcissism. It is a cover up for low self esteem. But some people live that role, like first it becomes like a mask that they put on, and then it becomes, then the costume kind of just turns into their skin, and they lose the sight of the fact that that's not their real self.
Right. So for him, he had this need to deflate his ego because and you can see it too in his writings, how he was egotistical, and he had a need to reduce that. And being the egotistical person he was, he assumed that we were all going to fit into that. And maybe most of the guys did at that time, but, yeah. So you put something together, the steps together from the perspective of someone who's coming into the rooms with a different set of coping mechanisms, where you're from a place more being more codependent, lower self-esteem. And I wonder if you can talk about the difference between the two, the narcissist and then the person that's shame-based.
Yeah, I actually have a whole chapter on that. But I went through some of the characteristics, like a narcissistic person has a sense of entitlement. They expect special treatment. They expect people to comply with their demands. I have almost no sense of entitlement. And, I feel undeserving, unworthy. If there's something good there, I best leave it for someone who deserves it more than I do. They pretty much a narcissist will take whatever they want because they assume they deserve it. And I won't even ask for what I want because I assume I don't deserve it. We both seek validation from others, but a narcissist seeks validation to prove he's the best, and shame-based people seek validation more like just to confirm that they're not as bad as they think they are. Hoping to feel that. Narcissists are self-centered and they think the world revolves around them. People like me that adopt this other survival strategy are other-centered. We focus all the time on what will people think if I do this? How will it look if I do that? Not how will I be if I choose this course of action, but how will it look if I choose this course of action?
Yeah, I thought that was a great comparison, and you were careful to note that it's kind of a continuum. You might find yourself in both categories, but overall, if you see yourself in the shame-based category more so than the narcissist category, then this is going to be a useful tool for you. This book and this way of looking at the steps will be useful for you.
Right. And I don't want to force anybody that didn't fit into Bill's little pigeonhole to think that now they have to fit into mine, because, there are other trauma responses. There's flight and there's freeze. And I didn't write about them because that wasn't my experience and I don't know a lot about it. And I hope other people will write about that.
And, I know people like Bill who are narcissists, and they would benefit from something from what he had to do. I mean, when you think about it, the narcissist can never be wrong, always has to be the best, all this kind of stuff, as their way of dealing with their life. They do need that. So I wouldn't want to take that away from them either.
Well, Sorry, I was almost about to get political, but it's the
I know.
low-hanging fruit.
I couldn't.
It's hard to
I
go
know.
for.
There's an elephant in the
We'll skip that.
room. I know. Actually, I was thinking about that as I was reading all of that. But yeah, it's just really, really interesting. So anyway, you also talk about you wrote about the processing of feelings and how it seems that sometimes in the program we tend to kind of gloss over the feelings. And correct me if I'm wrong in how I understood this, that it's more like we don't really process them. There's a higher power is going to take away from it. There's some way that we just kind of brush those away. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, about the processing of feelings and how we handle and how you deal with that.
So again, this probably is different strategies for different people. But for me, I learned to repress my feelings when I was very young because nobody was interested in talking to me about them anyway. I didn't even know how to really differentiate them. I was feeling okay or I was feeling bad, that hungry, angry, lonely, tired. I didn't know if I was lonely, and I didn't know if I was angry. Those would be bad category. But so I like the saying, feelings are like children. You don't have to let them drive the car, but you can't just keep locking them in the trunk. And mine have been locked in the trunk for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And other people have the other problem. They let them drive the car. They don't. And one of my sisters is kind of like that. But anyhow, they're still in there. They need to come out. And it's very important to get in touch with the anger over abuse, which means to get over the denial about the abuse first. And that's all a process. You have to feel the feeling. You have to acknowledge it. You have to. This is the only way that the feelings can attenuate. Can diminish so that they're not, because when we don't handle them and they're still inside us, they still drive our behavior even though we're not aware of them. We'll have oversized reactions to little triggers because because of all the things that's happened to us in the past, that one little thing brings up again, but we don't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
We're not aware that that's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if it was in that chapter where you wrote about this, but it was something that I could relate to, that sometimes these feelings come out like there's a delayed reaction,
For me, because I learned to repress anger at such a young age that, somebody will say something. I talked about that somebody that I was driving and they asked me to pull back a little bit. And, being the codependent people pleaser, without even thinking, my foot's on the brake before they even finish their sentence. Oh, sure. And the next day I thought, wow, I would never do that to someone,
Right.
and then I got really mad.
Yeah. I found that funny on a lot of different levels. First of all, it's kind of funny that she was kind of terrified of your driving enough to ask you to pull back. But also, I could relate so well to that, having that delayed reaction. That just comes from repressing those feelings, the anger and whatever, and not letting them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. My knee-jerk reaction is to comply. Where Bill's was defiance, mine is compliance.
Yeah. I wonder, did you have a similar experience as me? Look, I'm now old. I'm looking back at my recovery, which started 33 years ago, and I'm glad that I stayed sober, and overall it was a good experience. But sometimes I wish I could go back in time and talk to that guy and say, you know what? You really don't have to conform to this. You don't have to try to make yourself fit in. But I was always so important for me to conform to whatever the group wanted. were you doing that? And was it, how did you break free from that? If that's what you were, if you were in that mode?
It was really hard, and that's why I wrote the book. Mainly was because I don't, for other people that may be going through the same experience, you come into AA and they tell you what you're like, and it may not be what you're like.
Right. But you try to force yourself into that.
And not only that, but to tell me I'm self-will when riot was just a massive shame trigger, because I was tiptoeing around trying to be polite to everyone. I mean, I could say drunk driving, that's self-will run riot. I'm obviously not thinking about the other drivers, but my overall conduct is to be more courteous toward others than I am to myself. So, yeah, and well, at home, when I was a kid growing up, I got gaslighted all the time. My mom would, if I said I'm hungry, no, you're not. I'm hurt, no, you're not. You just want sympathy. I'm sick, no, you're not. You're just trying to get attention. And these are all symptoms of her not wanting to respond to a child's needs. But they were all put on me as, don't trust what you're feeling. Don't trust what you're feeling, as it's wrong. You just don't know yourself as well as your mom does. So some of these messages that I got in AA were total gaslighting of me. This is who you are. Well, you know what? I don't really think I do that. I'm trying to think of all these times I tried to control situations, and I try to control people's impressions of me. That's typical codependence. Only show people, the good side of you, what you want them to see. But I wasn't controlling. In fact, for me, it's like a sin to enforce my will over someone else's. Like, that makes me feel terrible that you would think I would do that. But yet that's what they kept telling me. And it was only really when I came to secular AA, and I was already 28 years sober before I met a single other person that was sober and secular. And man, I went to that concert or the conference in Santa Monica, and I felt like I had, just gotten out of a communist country. And wow, there's freedom of speech here. The gag order's been lifted. I can say what I really think about AA. I can question some of the things in the book, and that's okay. And that really liberated me a lot too, because it wasn't just the God thing that I struggled with. It was the whole personality thing too.
Yeah. Okay. So your experience is pretty similar to mine then. Cause I was sober for 25 years before I began questioning the whole higher power thing is where it started for me. And so, yeah, so it's good to know that it's good to know that you struggle too.
Well, and the interesting thing is when you read that, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, Harry Tiebout or Tebow, but anyhow, so he says the main reason for a higher power was because these narcissists needed to realize that they were not God, right? And that is the whole reason that higher power got tangled up with the sobriety message to begin with, because it was a big deal. That was a psychic change for them. You're not God. There is a God. It's not you. Well, that wasn't my issue. My issue is I think I'm a piece of crap.
Right. Right. So it would have been nice to have this for me at that time. So this is a great service for anybody who's starting out in the program. This is probably my favorite book that I've read so far that takes a look at the steps from a different perspective. What's really interesting too about it is you don't even really rewrite the actual wording of the steps, but you kind of describe the process differently. And what I really like is before you even have somebody even think about going through the steps, you have a step 0 where you gotta get them ready to even start this. And I wonder if you can talk about that and how you came to understand that was important.
Well, yeah, because all, when I read the steps on the wall, it was all, I'm bad, I do this wrong, I'm going to look at how bad I am. And, I've been doing that my whole life. And now we're going to really tear into it. Oh boy.
Yeah.
I wanted, it's helpful to do the steps with a positive attitude, like not like this is punishment. This is punishment for being a drunk. You have to go, you have to go through this hazing. The steps are an opportunity to learn about ourselves, and we have to get some solid ground under ourselves to begin that. We have to try to stop the criticism in our heads of everything we say and do, and the self doubt of, do I really think this, or do I just think I think this? If you've been gaslighted a lot, that you have that going on too. And so I have exercises for like doing. I did lots of affirmations for a long time, because for me it was like a taboo to say something nice about myself in my own voice. I felt like this guy was going to crack open the first time I did it. It was such a no-no. and so I needed that, and to start some self-nurturing. Like, it's okay to spend a little money on myself. It's okay to take a bubble bath, instead of saying no, too frivolous. It's okay. It's okay to relax. I always felt like I have to prove my worthiness to exist. I have to justify my existence. I always felt like that. So I have to always be doing something constructive, and relaxing is not acceptable.
Yeah. I remember at some point early in my recovery in AA, and I was thinking about the steps, and I was maybe talking to myself, I don't know. And it occurred to me that these steps are tearing you down before they build you up. And it's like, I didn't really need any more tearing down. When I got there, I was already torn down. And what I like about step 0 is it recognizes where I think probably most people are when they come into the rooms. I don't really believe that most of us come in there thinking that, we're so great, but maybe there are a lot too. But I mean, for most of us, this is a low point in our life. The last thing we need, I think, is to be torn down even more. So it's kind of nice to start off. I really like that chapter, because you're really giving a positive, optimistic look forward to what lies ahead and why you might want to be doing this. This isn't about beating yourself up. This is about learning about yourself, about learning how different ways of processing your experiences in life.
Like I say, I kind of reframe the steps to be more like, I don't use the term defects. The way that I learned to cope in the world, I'm going to admit it wasn't serving me. It wasn't working. My life was unmanageable. But they weren't character defects. They were adaptations that I had to make to survive in the environment that I was living in. And so they're survival skills. And I love the analogy of when I talked to that Iraqi vet with PTSD, and he said, when I walk down the street, it's not the same as when you walk down the street. He said, you're probably going, look, there's a tree, there's a bird. And I'm thinking, what's behind that tree? Is that bird carrying anything? What's under that bush? Okay, well, I grew up in Iraq, so, and I learned to be hypervigilant. And just like him, that type of thinking helped him survive in that environment. Now it's not helpful when he comes home. Those stressors are gone, and yet he still can't stop thinking that way. And for me, it's the same thing. I have these old thought patterns that I've built up over many, many years that worked for the environment I was living in, but they don't work so well now. But they're not defects of character. And that's a horrible thing, to force to abuse a kid so they're forced to adopt some off the norm strategies for coping with life, and then come to AA and tell them how bad they are for doing that.
It is a terrible term. Honestly, I don't think I've never had that term used prior in my life ever, prior to getting to AA. Character defects, defects of character. I never thought in terms of that. And so, although I probably felt that I was a defective character, having that label just intensified these feelings that I already had. It was like the last thing I needed. And for me, it was like many years later when I came to understand them the way that you understand them now, as no, these were coping mechanisms that I had developed to survive that were no longer working in a sane world. And when you get into the steps, one of my favorites of your steps is when you're writing about step 3. I see that step the same way as you do, as a commitment to recovery. But what I really liked about what you wrote was your description of what recovery is. Because you're going to make a commitment to something, and you wrote down what it is to you. And I think that would be a good practice. A lot of us will like write down what the steps are to us or whatever. But I don't know if I've ever read someone that said, what is recovery to you? And I kind of chuckled a little bit. No altering substances except for caffeine.
Yeah. Well, I drink coffee.
I do too. I'm drinking it right now.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, and it probably would have changed and grown a lot over the years. Like when you first come in, it's probably just all about abstinence is the main thing. But when I got to learn that was just scratching the surface of what my actual issues were, it became, that staying sober is only the beginning, because in order to do the recovery work, I have to feel my feelings. I have to be in reality. I have to sit with the discomfort in order to learn how to handle it without drinking. But there's so much more than that. And yeah, let's see, step 3. So some of the things that I put down were, besides the abstinence, the acknowledgement that I can't do this by myself. I need other resources besides my own, and I need to be part of a recovery community. That's huge for me. I try to feel my feelings and manage them appropriately. I try to be authentic instead of saying, well, I'm going to act like this to impress this person, and now I'm going to act like that to impress that person. Developing boundaries, defining my boundaries, and then defending my boundaries, exercising.
We didn't even talk about that, but that was something that you wrote about too, when you talked about, some things that we need to understand before you even get into the recovery process, like what are boundaries, and you wrote a lot about that, setting boundaries, and you wrote about, this concept of self and being codependent. Really important stuff to consider, because most of your book is not dealing with the steps, which is so interesting. Your book really deals with really the underlying stuff that those steps are going to be dealing with, and it's good to have an understanding of what all these things are before you even have to get into that whole process of changing.
Yeah. I love history, and I think if I don't know my own history, I'm going to suffer for it. The big book says that, we get down to causes and conditions, but they don't get down to them near as much as I do.
Yeah. Yeah. I also kind of wonder sometimes if your engineering background has something to do with it, because you're trying to, it's like you're understanding the problem. Like, I really need, I see there's a problem and there's a solution, and you're kind of matching the two up. I might be overthinking a little bit, but it just seemed like, wow, this just makes so much sense the way that this is being laid out. I just thought it was brilliant. Especially, not having a background in, you know, counseling or anything like that, just being a person in recovery, that you were able to put this together was just absolutely amazing to me, actually.
Thank you very much.
But
that's high praise.
When you go into the inventory process, there are some things that you tweaked a little bit there in step 4. I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit. Because, and we touched on it a little bit, where, one thing for sure is you don't ask yourself for those childhood situations, what part did I play? You leave that.
Right. We did not play any part in being abused as a child, and it's not our fault. And I mean, the reason it comes up in the 4th step is because we often have resentments against these people for things they said or did to us. And so you make a list of resentments. But then the big book tells you to find, invariably we stepped on their toes in the past. But that doesn't work for childhood trauma. So and then that's the part where, to get rid of the resentments, I actually stand up to these people in my head. And
that's right.
Yeah.
I found that really powerful. And that was the part that kind of got me to thinking that I never did that mentally. I never had that exercise where I went back and said, and addressed them as, you remember when you did that when, I thought that was brilliant and useful.
Well, and I didn't do it I didn't do it in person with my parents. I did it like therapeutically, like to straighten it out in my own mind.
Right. Exactly. Like, it wouldn't do any good to go confront them. If it does good, then fine. But I like that idea. I don't know. I think with me, and I guess I don't want to go too much into talk about me. I can't help it, because when I read a book like yours, it makes me think about how it impacts me. And, like that was the beautiful thing about reading this book, Beth, is I would often put it down and stop and think, and any book that makes you stop and think, and makes me stop and think, I know that the author has done a really good job, because I don't often like to stop and think, but this really gave me pause to stop and think and question, wow, have I ever done that? I don't think I ever did. Maybe I should, really, really powerful.
It's very empowering. And I, as a person that basically gave away my power most of my life, and by that I mean I let other people decide how I'm going to feel, how I feel about myself. I only look as good as you tell me I look today. I'm only as smart as you tell me I'm smart. I'm only going to have a good day as long as you're having a good day. So that's what I call giving away my power, rather than being a separate person. Then I also had, in the 4th step, we have what I called resentments affecting my self-esteem, because that is actually one of the categories that the big book offers for how does it affect me. But what I discovered was that's really a misconception of what self-esteem is. You hurt my self-esteem because you made me feel bad about myself. Well, self-esteem doesn't come from what other people say and do. It comes from how we feel about ourselves on the inside. What actually is happening is you said something that triggered me because I have a lot of shame in this area, or you're getting too close to discovering how defective I am, or you're going to make me say something sarcastic or angry to deflect you as a defense mechanism because you're getting too close. And to really focus on self-esteem is not to focus on what other people are saying or doing. It's for me to get rid of these buttons that people can push. And that's my responsibility. It's not the fault of the other people.
Right. And you also addressed fear more substantially. I've talked about this part of the 4-step a lot on this podcast, and my recollection of it is that the fear part is the one part that my sponsor told me I didn't do right. And it's beyond me, because I did just what it told me to do. You list your fears and you ask yourself why you have them. And that's basically all they do, and
then you ask God to remove them.
You ask God to remove them, because the reason that you have the fears is because you were God. You thought you were God, right? So I don't know. So how did you approach fears?
My recovery is pretty cognitive, and so this is not something I've ever studied, but there is a skill set called risk management. So I look at a fear, and first of all, is this a real fear or not a real fear? And I always think people think I'm fat, but I know that I'm not. So so that's not a real fear, and I can just kind of get myself off the ledge with that one, because that's not real. That's all in my head. I know I believe it because it sounds good to me, but it's really all in my head. And and then I have a fear of one of my son's families is very religious, and they think I'm going to hell, and I mean that's what they're teaching my grandkids, and I don't want to butt heads with them. I want them in my life. I want to see my grandkids. I want to have family get-togethers. So this is a risk that I can mitigate by not commenting on their views, and by not, stirring things up, not making an issue when I can just let it go. And so it's a real risk that at some point it could come to a head and, create a big rift in the family. But my part is that I can do things that mitigate that risk.
That's such a good way of looking at it. I work for an insurance company, so it's useful for me to think in terms of that.
Yeah. Right.
In terms of that way too.
So right. Fears can be dealt with rationally, not in the moment that we're feeling it. In that moment, that's when you do the pause when agitated, because when we're having a big emotional reaction, those chemicals overtake in our brain the ability to think about it rationally. And that's why we do the pause. But there's so many fears that I can, mitigate in advance of them happening. And there's other fears that there's absolutely nothing I can do about whatsoever. Like I'm on an airplane, is it going to crash? Well, that's completely out of my hands. So just sort of having a plan of how to deal with fears is how I do it. I give that one example when I went to a new meeting and it was a split level building,
that was
and
kind
I
of fun.
freaked out. I freaked out because there was the sign that said AA in between a set of stairs going up and a set of stairs. And I just stopped in my tracks and went,
I know.
I don't know why I had that reaction, but it's because one of my issues is I'm afraid I'm going to look stupid.
Yeah, you're going to walk into the wrong room and say.
because my dad always deliberately did stuff to make you look stupid, because that's how he got over on you and made you feel small. And but I just paused and I thought, okay, it's 6:45 a.m. Probably the only people here are the people going to the meeting. If I go to the wrong room, it's probably empty. And if it's not, then there's probably other people that have made the same mistake that I've made, right? And so then I could walk through the fear.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a wonderful way of looking at it. I think I'm going to be adopting that approach, is just mitigating the risk. It makes total sense. So when you were writing about amends, my actual experience with amends was pretty along the lines of what you were writing about, is that most of my amends I needed to make were to myself. I wonder if you can talk about the amends process, just to make sure. I don't want to put words into I don't want to have misunderstood what I read, but it seemed like that's the approach that you were taking.
Yeah. I think we went over some of them, and well, when we did step 4, I added a harm to self section. There's already a harm to other section, but I looked at harm to self, and so I hold myself to impossibly high standards, and that I can't live up to them, and you know, and it also makes me criticize other people that aren't living up to my standards, which is not. Why should they? It's not their standards, right? So I look at those things, and so I'm going to stop trying to hold myself to such impossibly high standards. I may make mistakes. That doesn't mean I am a mistake. See, my childhood conditioning is not your behavior. This behavior was inappropriate. Let's learn how to do it differently. It was shame on you. You're in disgrace. Go to your room. So when I make a mistake, I feel like that, like, oh, I'm going to get sent out. I'm being expelled from the group because I'm so horrible. And I learned to stop doing that to myself. I just being kinder to myself. Another thing is blowing my mistakes all out of proportion. And when actually I'm only contributing a small part of the whole picture, but I'll take responsibility for the entire failure if it fails. Yeah. And then as a sort of positive amends, one of my traits is to fail to acknowledge my achievements. And so make a list of your past accomplishments: graduations, jobs, promotions, performances, contests, things that were hard that you got through, but you got through them: losing weight, quitting smoking, getting in shape, finishing a big project, staying sober for however long it's been. Say, yes, I did that. That was me. Way to go, me. I deserve some credit for that. Because I was great at belittling my contribution. I won a huge. After I was an engineer, I became a criminal defense attorney, and I won a huge trial one time, like that you would never expect the defense to win, and the guy would be in prison for the rest of his life, and I really thought he was innocent. So it was pretty high stakes, and I won, and I'm getting all these big kudos from the other attorneys, and I said, well, my supervisor made a couple suggestions. That's probably what put it over the edge. I couldn't, and I got into an Ivy League college, and I was, well, that's probably just because my grandfather went there. That's why they let me in. So, well, I also had good grades and good test scores.
Right.
I belittle my own part in it and give the credit to somebody else all the time. So these are amends that I need to make. Yeah. Yes, I had a part in this. I did this.
Yeah. And when you start getting into the recovery process, you will achieve goals. You will get things done that you weren't able to do because of your addiction. And I had a lot of that in my recovery. I went back to school, my life got better. I was achieving things. But the problem that I had in my little home group is, boy, they really drummed in this really harsh idea of humility, that you couldn't even talk about anything like, hey, I graduated, whatever, it's like me. It's like, no. And yeah. So because I came into the program in my 20s, I was 25 and spent most of my life there, I am still working on coming out of that mentality where I have to let myself know it's okay to take credit for something that I achieved.
See, that's because that's geared at narcissists who take credit for other people's work and and take more credit than is due them. But I'm the opposite. I take less credit than is due. It's so hard for me to even. I wish you didn't have to buy it. I mean, I didn't know how to. My heart said write this because it might be helpful to some people, but it comes out in the form of a book, and it costs money to do that, and you hope to at least make back what you put into it. But I cannot advertise. I cannot self-promote. I just feel terrible doing it.
Oh, I know. And I'm there too. And as a podcaster, you almost have to do some of that. And I'm not good about doing it. And I need to do more of it. I will sometimes put down what I do with the podcast. But when I was reading your book, seriously, Beth, when I read it, I said, I'm so glad she wrote this. This is a huge contribution to the recovery literature. There isn't anything out there right now that I know of that talks about self-esteem issues in relation to the 12 steps. You treat the program very respectfully and with someone who actually understands it and knows it. And I just thought it was great. Like I said, this is like going back to 1988 and giving this to that kid that was just starting out and say, hey, maybe check this out. You might not, you don't necessarily have to be the power driver. But anyway.
Right. And so when I came in, I was so vulnerable, and I had such a weak sense of self that I tried to believe everything they told me. And, when I tried to adopt, if you say this is how I am, then I guess that's how I am. And it was just not a good fit at all. I mean, it was really a misdiagnosis.
Exactly.
And it was damaging. I mean, it wasn't just, a waste of time. It was damaging.
Right.
Because it re-traumatized me.
Right. And you got a lot of help outside too, right? You therapy
yes.
and so forth. Mm-hmm. And
well, yeah, I mean, all the stuff, because it's not addressed in AA. Right. I got outside help for all of this. Yeah.
Right. Well, again, thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming on this podcast and talking about it. You did a great job explaining it to me.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's been fun. I look forward to seeing you again one of these days. It's been a long time. I look forward to seeing almost anybody anymore.
Right.
That's another episode of Beyond Belief Sobriety. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support our podcast with recurring monthly contributions, head on over to patreon.com/Beyond Belief Sobriety or become a member of our YouTube channel. If you'd like to make a one-time contribution, then visit our website, beyondbeliefsobriety.com, and click on the donate button. I do appreciate your support. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back again real soon with another episode of Beyond Belief Sobriety.